A couple of things before we start, because this is new to me. High seminar, when I heard the title of it, frightened the life out of me. So, I'm going to talk away. I can talk for Ireland. I can easily fill 2 hours, so you need to stop me when it's time to stop me. If you want to discuss anything that I put up, feel free to stop me at that point and say, you need clarification, or can I say more about an example, or just to discuss a point I'm making. I think that would be more productive than waiting to the end. And just go with the flow. So feel free to talk about anything connected, projects or whatever. I'm not hung up on this talk, so we can break off or go on tangents or whatever. Is that okay? The talk, I suppose, is structured around a book that Pete Wright and I published, I think about 2 years ago now, and some projects and some ideas since that have, I hope, pushed some of the ideas on a little bit. And the book was really our attempt, about 10 years before, we had spent a lot of time thinking about experience. And I was saying to some of the students yesterday, just by pure coincidence, and we were talking about plagiarism at lunchtime, not plagiarism, just by coincidence, UX was taking off at the time. And we wrote this book called Technology as Experience. And it was a fairly conceptual book, fairly philosophical, and for some reason lots of people bought it, and it got highly cited. And I think the reason is UX. And ours, if anything, was a critique of UX as it was developing. And it was saying that in a discipline like HCI, we have to stop appropriating words and just tagging them on to some phrase that we like, and then carrying on as before. It was prompted really by a talk that Pete and I heard at a workshop at CAI a couple of years earlier, when somebody was talking about experience, and he was from a commercial company, and everything he said in that talk was straight out of user-centered design. There was nothing different. It was the stuff that Norman had talked about 15 years before that, and we thought, there's something wrong with this. We keep on doing this in our discipline. Let's try to put some foundations in for a different way of thinking about human-computer interaction if experience is meant to make a difference. And then, 10 years on, we had spent a fair bit of time thinking about participatory projects and participatory design, and we had gotten ourselves into trouble with some of the participatory design community for some of the things we said at conferences and in papers, partly because we were making a similar case. We were saying some of the stuff that is going in under participatory design has a weird notion of what participation is. And now everything is harmonious, and we talk to each other again. But for a while, some of what we had to say was taken as a critique of participatory design. One of the things that the book tries to clarify is that it's not particularly about participatory design at all. In the same way as the first book was trying to clarify experience, the second book is trying to clarify participatory. And we're very specifically talking about participatory projects, some of which may be design, and as you can see, some of which you won't recognize as design, though I think they're design. But it's not always technology that's being designed. And because of that, and I suppose because of the way we think about things and the way in which we respond to things, politics and aesthetics, I hope, come out as strands out of this talk. We tend to think about human-computer interaction in terms of what it feels like to somebody, what it means to them, and what it might mean to them in terms of the kind of social and organizational worlds in which they live. I'm conscious that almost anywhere I stand, I want to block some people, so I move around and block. I'd be an equal opportunity blocker. So that's the broad background, and I'll get on with it by saying that there's a kind of a zeitgeist moment around participatory in lots of different areas over the last 3, 4, 5 years. We hear it mentioned about the political circles. The two areas that I'm most interested in it in is obviously in the kind of conversations about the ways in which we engage with technology and the ways in which technology is shaping part of our lives for good or ill. And the second area that I'm interested in it in is in art. So the book's on the left, one by Claire Bishop and the other a collection by her. Claire Bishop is a really interesting participatory artist who takes a wickedly political view on position on participatory art, and is again quite critical of those participatory art projects where you've gone and you've sat down, you've had a cup of tea with an artist, and she would be quite critical about that because what's changed at the end of that? So she's looking for some indicator of change, some effect of the participation per se. And as I go through the talks, there's as much inspiration and influence from art as there is from science or from HCI, but it's all, I hope, directed towards HCI and interaction design. And as I mentioned that earlier, it comes from this book, and I'm specifically putting up a little part of a review that John Carter did of the book, because I think he captured quite nicely what we were trying to do. He talked about participation being one of those phrases that can mean anything, partly because it's used in HCI in a way that allows anybody taking part in a project in any way at all to be counted as participatory. And his review was saying, look, it would be a better thing if participation meant more than involvement. And it's about time we worked out what the more than involvement was. And he noticed in this book that we tries to develop different genres of participation around the notion of different interpersonal relationships that those participatory models supported. And my 3 or 4 case studies are going to be around those different interpersonal relations. So in other words, what we're trying to do in the book is say, being involved in a study is fine, that's involvement. Participating in the study, maybe the threshold should be a bit higher. And actually, when we think of the different kinds of participation that go on in HCI, they're quite different from each other, and it might be a good idea to organise them. Seeing as a very kind introduction, told you that I'm from Cork. Cork is in Ireland. I should have said at the start, by the way, if I'm speaking too fast for anybody for whom English is a second or a third language or whatever, slow me down as well. I wanted to boast a little bit, because Scandinavians think they invented participatory design. Yeah. An Irish guy did, years earlier. And there's a little bit of a kind of an essential trait in a little, it's not even a trait, it's a thin fibre in Irish kind of computer science, engineering, human sciences and so on, that's worth picking out. There's a guy called Mike Cooley, who, paper was published in 1980, he was doing this work way back before that. An engineer from farming land in Ireland, some part of Tipperary, working with Lucas in the UK at a time when much of the kind of, quite a number of factories across the UK, lots of the production processes were being automated, people were being fitted into an automated system. He was an engineer there who was expected to manage all of this and to do the kind of person-machine interaction stuff. And one of the outcomes of it was he became a trade union militant and argued strongly against the way things were being done in Lucas, and ended up writing a beautiful little book called Architecture B, where he made a philosophical argument for people taking power in these situations and being the architects rather than the bees. And this was moderately influential. It definitely has an impact in industrial engineering circles. One person that I'm aware of championed him in HCI, and that's Liam Bannon. And Liam Bannon mentions Mike Cooley whenever he can stick him into a talk, because Mike Cooley is probably, his work is probably the little book that has inspired a small number, but a reasonable number of people to be interested in HCI and user-centered design and so on, out of Irish universities. And Liam was one of those people as well, or is one of those people as well, who has inspired people to get involved in HCI. Liam's argument here is a kind of a polemical argument saying that we need to move beyond, this is back in the early 90s, user-centered design, where the user is treated as an object in the inquiry, to user-involved design, where the user is part of defining, is party to defining the inquiry. And he made this kind of argument for 5 years more, and it was a strong and powerful argument over the early 90s, and I think it was quite influential in CSCW, Computer Supported Cooperative Work, and in HCI. And then the first book that Pete and I did really tried to bring another element into all of that and say that when we think of people as involved in design, as involved in designing, shaping, controlling, and so on, the systems that we are creating for them, we need to think about them in ways that go beyond what was common at the time, which was a kind of a cognitive psychological perspective on what a person is. So my training and background is experimental cognitive psychology. As I was telling some of the students yesterday for my PhD, I spent 3 years absolutely boring the lives out of people and sending them to sleep, because my experiments were very early human factors type experiments where the job was to see at what point a chemical process controller would start missing signals if I just bored them with the same routine task for hours, and I literally had people fall asleep while doing that. Good work, important work, but what we were trying to do in HCI seemed to be different from that, and yet the models were not hugely dissimilar. So the kind of models that come out of GOMS and other kinds of cognitive modelling, or the kind of cognitive experimental studies that were very common in the 90s, and are still very common actually, and which have a good purpose. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing them, but we need to know their limits. They have a very good purpose. If what they're trying to do is understand how this cognitive system and this information processing system interact with each other. Trying to understand how this person interacts with this machine, or lives with this machine, or uses this machine, or sees it as something he almost can't give up on now, even though he dislikes the Apple corporate approach, and that he took off with the first SEs. When he loved the idea of computers being designed over NATIC or whatever, then you need to understand me and this thing as a thing beyond its computational power. And that's what we were saying there. So there's a strand in Irish HCI that I feel I kind of come out of and want to kind of appropriate and signify to people. And then here's the question for the talk, really. Going back to John Carroll's review, what can we say about participation if what we're going to do is see it as types of transformative interpersonal relations? So if we're going to see participation as transforming the ways in which we live and relate to each other, what kind of conceptual tools do we need in order to be able to do that? That's the question for the talk, really. And I'm going to try and answer that question by going through some case studies, but before that, setting up some scoping ideas and some kind of critical ideas against which to kind of judge the outcome of the talk, but also the kind of argument that's being developed. So in doing this, part of the scoping is to say that when I think about participatory projects in HCI, I'm thinking about projects that have a fair share of these characteristics. They're dialogical in the sense that they're about relational things. They're about how we get on with each other. They're about how we live with each other or work with each other. Whether the we be designers and users, or indeed designers and non-users, whom we leave out of the picture too often, or whether the we be this group of people around the system who are going to use the system, it's dialogical in that sense, in that relational sense, but also dialogical in the sense that we create something in that dialogue. We create a way of being, a way of living, a way of working, and the kind of projects that I'm going to talk about all bear that out, I think. Any intervention, including design intervention, shifts the way in which people live their lives, even if just subtly and in a small way. I also want to argue that participatory projects, one of their main foci is technological imaginaries. Very often, what we do in participatory projects is trying to imagine something that's not there yet. So we're imagining a space within which people may live in the future or may not. We're creating ways of being, ways of belonging, ways of becoming that haven't been embedded in technology before we do that study. If it had, we're wasting our time doing the study. Participatory projects are inquiries. So I'm deliberately making a distinction between participatory projects, which I see as basic research, and goal-focused design type projects. They tend to be open work, and I'm appropriating an art term there. They tend to be open work in the sense that you finish it. So there's something put in front of us, but we all have to make sense of it, and we might make sense of it differently from each other. They're not going to define how we make sense of the outcome of this project, of the process, of any of those things. And that goes back up to dialogical. Anything dialogical is open. It's plural, it's open. Even if it's just a relationship between two people, I may see it differently to how you see it. And so it's open until we come to some resolution on that, and we move on then, so it's still open. And their focus, and I'm going to use this in a minute to say, actually it doesn't matter very much whether technology comes out of these projects or not. Their focus is reconfiguring social relations. And to the extent that technology comes out of it, the focus is not the technology, it's the reconfiguration of the socio-material assemblage that results. And if we focus on the technology, we've lost the participation. Okay? So when I'm talking about socio-material assemblage, I'm borrowing straight from Lucy Suchman, and I'm making a kind of a Suchman point there. So if the focus is on the ways in which people organize and live and communicate and so on around the technology, great. If it's on the technology per se, it's a different kind of project. And in the participatory projects that I've looked at and that I've been involved in, there's always a kind of an aspiration towards a legacy. You've interfered with people's lives, there's kind of an ethical responsibility to make sure something useful comes out of that.
Yep. I'd like to ask about reconfiguring social relations. Do you mean that in a practical sense or a cultural sense, or both?
I think both. I think as the person doing the research, I probably have no control over it. So in some cases, and I think we'll see this in a minute, In some cases, it's very, very practical. In other cases, it's going to be about the meaning of something like dementia, and you were there yesterday, so you've seen some of these case studies, Maria, and apologies for that. It's going to be something about the meaning of dementia as I live it in the setting in which I live it, which I think is cultural, probably legal, societal, and civic. It's all of those things. Or it has implications spreading out through all of those areas. But as the person running the project, I have almost no control where it stops. Okay? It's almost like putting a catalyst in there and being as sensitive as you can, and then letting life take over in a way. Okay, so that's the scope of what I'm talking about. That's quite a wide scope, and I think the projects will kind of partly narrow it down a bit, but actually open some of those things up even further. And I suppose the critical bit, the bit where I want to think quite hard when I'm thinking about a talk like this, or when I'm writing about this, about a project, or about a piece of writing or whatever, I want to think about these questions. So when I give you projects, and I'm giving you projects in a minute now, all of which I was involved in, so I think fair game. I'm putting my projects up there, not anybody else's projects. And it's fair game to ask questions like, was the participation really voluntary in these? And does it matter? And I think in at least one of them, there's a real question of that. Are all participants treated as equal? And are they treated as equal to the designer? And now equal doesn't mean the same. I think it would be a dreadful world if we were all the same, or we tried to kind of equalize each other in the sense that we treated each other as the same. We're very different from each other. But are we treated equally in this situation? And I'm going to try to kind of unpack that a little bit afterwards by talking a little bit about what French philosopher Jacques Rancière has to say about the distribution of the sensible. And some of you might know his work better than I do, but I've been really impressed with it, and I've unashamedly used bits of it to try and unpack some of this stuff. Can we have participatory projects where the projects are co-authored? So I don't mean the outcome, but that as well. But where the project itself is the joint responsibility of all of those involved. So I'm pushing involvement now, the Banon's involvement, as far as I can. And I want to push it to the point where it breaks. I know there's an end point somewhere out there, but I want to push it as far as I can. Are the participators, and I include the designers, the people participating in the project, the human science researchers or whatever, are they collaborating? Who configures the project? Which is another way of asking the authorship question. Who decides who does what in these projects? And why should it be that person? And why should they have control over how the project is done? And the distribution is sensible. So Rancière's way of unpacking some of these things is what is sensible. And by sensible he means what's made available to the senses. So what can be seen, heard, felt, thought, and said within a project, and most importantly, by whom? Do we control what can be said by some people, or do we not? Okay, so they're my questions. And by the end of it, I hope we will have answered some of those about some projects. One of the guys that I found really inspiring on this, I suppose there were two guys that I found really inspiring on this, and I won't start with Dave Beach. I'll start with somebody else. There's an architect called Usman Haq, who was in the UK. Does anybody know his work? Do you know his work a bit? Yeah. He gave a talk in Boston College, I think it was. About 2009 or thereabouts. He gave a couple of talks actually at COI that year. And it just blew my mind. And I'm not the kind of person whose mind gets blown very easy. I'm a bit kind of pedantic and plodding or whatever. But this guy created architecture out of balloons and light. And it really felt like architecture. He showed us films of it in places like Singapore, where these structures stood next to skyscrapers and looked every bit as impressive. And what was more interesting is elements of the structure would be interactive. So, for example, your mobile phone, if you're one of 1,000 people on the ground, your mobile phone is going to light one of those balloons. Okay? So there's an ability to control from the ground some of what's up there. And they just looked amazing. And when we saw the films, the projects just looked entirely mind-blowing. Just how this guy's imagination worked and so on. And there are a number of other things he did around that. And his projects inspired me to think about participation. Trying to think about participation in HCI the way he was thinking about participation in architecture. Now, interestingly, he controlled everything in that situation. I didn't even think about that in 2009. I just loved what it looked like and how people were getting a kick out of interacting with it and so on. But he controlled everything. The outcome was absolutely amazing. Lasted for a couple of days, it was gone. Okay? So there were lots of things about it that weren't brilliant. But as you know, as a presentation to somebody who was starting to think hard about participation, this was a brilliant example. And it opened my reading to this kind of looking at the art world to see what was going on in the art world that might be relevant to thinking about participatory HCI, given that there was already quite a lot of critical conversation going on in the art world about participatory art. So you know what I mean by participatory art? Yeah? Has anybody ever had the pleasure of going into a gallery and there's a participatory art thing going on and you have to interact with it and you feel awkward and clumsy and oh God, what am I doing here and what have you? Because I definitely have. I'm one of those people who, for his sins, goes to Venice every couple of years for confession, to the Venice Biennale, and there's participatory art all over that. The real reason I go, my wife is an artist, so she drags me along. And that meant I had to learn something about it if I was going to enjoy it. And I literally did have the experience of going into one of the pavilions and sitting down and having a cup of tea with the artist. And this was clearly very important to the artist, so I'm not kind of downplaying it or whatever, but I came out having had no experience other than kind of experience I have trying to a cafe. Other people, I'm sure, had more interesting experiences than that. But I've also engaged with ones that do much more interesting things and seem to have the power to get you to think differently about stuff. Dave Beach is somebody who writes about these projects. And I think his writing is very powerful in the area. And one of the things he does is, and the title of this little article he did include me out, really says it emblematically. He does a critique of participatory art, which takes a very antagonistic perspective. And I'll say something about that in a minute, but basically he asks the question, which is a little bit like the question I've tried to ask with HCI here. He asks the question about, really, you're going around an art festival or exhibition or whatever, and you come upon this thing, do you actually have any choice in whether you're going to engage or not? Isn't there an awkwardness if you just walk past it and so on? So he asks those kind of structural questions, essentially about, and this is, I think, one of his most powerful points, essentially about the invitation to take part. And what he's talking about here is something that we all do in any HCI or design projects that we do with people who participate with us in those projects. We invite them to take part. And Beach's argument is that the invitation always carries certain rules and restrictions, as well as potentialities with it, always carries a kind of a contract, a kind of a commitment, sometimes made explicit, sometimes not made explicit. He makes the point that when an artist asks you to be yourself in one of these things, there's something a bit disingenuous about that. As if being yourself wasn't playing a role anyway. You're definitely playing a role now if you sit down and have a cup of tea with him. And he wonders the extent to which participatory art leaves people as passive as they were at the start. Because the aim very often is to try and get you activated in some way. To what extent does it do that? To what extent does the invitation so stultify your involvement in it by making you feel awkward or by making you feel lost? I don't know what I meant to be doing here. So feeling a little bit foolish or whatever. To what extent it actually just pacifies you, just makes you passive in the situation. And he does this in a really interesting, critical way, which I kind of like to use to think about participatory projects in HCI. And he very carefully argues that the kind of binary of either participating or not participating, you're either in or you're out. You're either active or you're passive. You're participating in the project or you're passive and not participating in some way is really, really unhelpful. So, as a kind of a teaser, participatory projects in HCI, what in God's name does that mean? Is there a boundary beyond which we're participating and before which we're not participating? Or, as he argues, should we instead be thinking about something like a kind of a more nuanced constellation of things like agency and control and self-determination and power and so on? My move from Beach, just because Beach referenced this guy, was Jack Rancière, who wrote a really interesting book on the spectator in theatre. Fortunately, all his books are really little, because it takes me half a day to read a couple of pages. And I like theatre, I go to theatre quite a lot, and when I hear I'm going to something experimental, my dread is that I'm going to have to perform it in some way. And Rancière makes the point that that kind of participatory theatre, taken as not specific plays, but that kind of approach, the binary approach, where either the audience is dragged up to the stage or the stage and the actors go down to them, is just a banal way of looking at participation. His argument is, when I sit there listening and looking and thinking, and remember he's the guy now who talked about the senses earlier and being sensitive, and when I'm encouraged to listen and look and think and engage in those kinds of ways, I am being active. I may be sitting in my seat, not moving, and actually not moving and totally fixed on it, I am being active. And that's the trade from Beach to Rancière to a notion of what's important here is the constellation that Beach talks about and the way to get at it for a HCI person in terms of participating projects, or for me anyway, was the distribution of the sensible. So, who has a voice, who doesn't? Who controls who has a voice? If I'm forced to sit in the seat, which might actually be an experience. You go to a theatre and you're in the middle of a role, and the intermission is an hour away, and you realise this is a big mistake. You don't have the agency to get off the water. So you're trapped then. But for the most part, you're there because you want to be there, you're engaged, you're paying attention. That's participation. We don't all have to go up on the stage for it to be participation. And just think about that as a kind of an exemplar of what I want to say about some of the HCI projects that I'm going to move on.
You mentioned it yourself, the word I was looking for, attention.
Yeah.
Because I can very much be at a place, accident or purposefully, and not paying attention. Am I really participating in that? Because that's basically the question. If students are looking in their Facebook pages, they might as well not be here.
I think that might be true. And Rancier's point is when you are paying attention, you are active.
I buy that.
Yeah.
But if you're there but not paying attention,
Yeah.
are you participating?
Yeah. And the answer is probably not. And to use that point, to make the point in a way, in a participatory HCI project or a participatory app project, when you're there and you're doing what you're told to do, but you're not paying any attention, you're not participating either. So the mistake is the binary of imaginary participation to be associated with bodily activity. Yeah? And it can be that, but it doesn't have to be that. So he and I think as well, following him, would see it as a kind of a fluid thing. It's not yes or no. It may be that if you're sitting there and you're not paying much attention, you are participating if you're disrupting other people. You know, so, but that's not a kind of a necessarily willful participation, though it might be in some cases. And the projects I'm going to go through and tell you about, I'm organised in accordance with the kind of different modes of participation that we talk about in the book. And this is, he's right, with whom I do a lot of this work. His background is psychology as well. We've both, psychologists spend lots of their time learning research methods. So we've both done a lot of this stuff. And when we looked at various participatory projects in HCI, we thought actually they're using quite different research methods. Let's use that as a way of trying to organize. Some of them had experts participating in the project as a proxy for the population of users. Some of them had properly selected representative samples, which a good experimental psychologist would always be careful to do because it has a big impact on how widely you can generalize. It probably has very little impact on how widely you can generalize in a kind of qualitative study or a piece of field research or whatever. But some of them were like that. And then in some of these projects that we were looking at, everybody who's interested and everybody who's likely to use whatever comes out of it is involved. And everybody might be 10 people. Okay? And I can talk more about that later on if it's useful, about that distinction. But maybe the best way to do it is talk about some of the projects and see what you think of the differences and similarities between them. And what I'm going to do with each of them, there are three, one for each of these. I'm going to talk about each of them, describe them a little bit to you, tell you some of the stories around them, and then draw some conclusions about them as participatory projects. Okay? So the aim here is that I'll make clearer what I'm trying to say by fleshing them out through some examples. And the first one is a project that I was involved in a small way. Rune Bersami works in Aarhus and came and spent some time with me in Cork. A couple of weeks, a few times, and we wrote a little paper together about his PhD project, which is called Banner Battle. And Banner Battle, the technology is this. It's a display, as you can see, in a soccer ground. The colours on the display become more vivid, louder if you like, more active, the louder the fans at one side or the other of the pitch shout. And blue is associated with one team, red is associated with the other team. And he did a really interesting study. He was interested in crowd behaviour, and he was a football fan. He did a really interesting study which looked at the ways in which the away fans, they take up less real estate because there are fewer of them so they don't shout as much, actually managed to win some of the time by waiting until they've run out of breath, pausing, and then these guys jump in straight away. And they have organised cheerleaders and everything. It's a big deal. And they do this without the banner, but the banner just exaggerated the whole thing. I thought the project was really interesting, really good fun, really interesting about crowd behaviour. But what I'm interested in talking about today is the way in which the project was done. It is a kind of a classical participatory design project out of a participatory design school which has the qualities of what you would think of as kind of our house participatory design. What he did was, as I said, based on the theory of crowd, which he got from sociology and some psychology. He was interested in doing something. I suppose he felt, as a football fan, that everybody was being tarred by the same brush, really. That noisiness and just getting involved and shouting for your team and so on was being confused with football violence and various things like that. So he was trying to make an intervention that would, and there was a second strand of it, I think, that he was sick to the teeth of the commercialisation of football grounds. And he wanted to make an intervention that was free, that could have an impact, and that you'd get a bit of a kick out of if you were a fan at the ground, and you didn't have to go and pay for it. Because he felt almost everything he was doing on a football ground those days, he had to go and pay for separately. So what he did is he did kind of workshops where he got fans of his local football club to come together, do kind of design workshops, come up with concepts that would be useful, what kinds of things they'd enjoy, what kinds of things they wouldn't enjoy, and so on. This is definitely involvement. I don't know to what extent it's participation, but it might be. Then he did things like go to matches with them, which he would have been doing anyway. And when the matches weren't too far away, they went on bus trips. Now, too far away actually, it goes up as far as 5 hours. So they go 5 hours on a bus. And he used the bus rides to kind of engage with them and to get a sense of what the experience of being a fan was like. And he's definitely a participant observer in the sense that he's a fan himself, and he would do this regularly anyway. And described the kind of fan culture very nicely, the ways in which fans wanted to identify with each other and express themselves as a group. Definitely, anytime I've been at a football match in Britain, this does not happen there, but he told me it happens all over Denmark, that there's a cheerleader who makes sure the fans shout and sing and so on at the right times, singing the songs that they all sing together, do the chants that they all do together. So it's kind of an organised activity. And out of that, these fans said, you know, we want some way of showing how good we are as away fans. So this was all about expressing their need to say, look, we, even though there's only a quarter of the number of us as there is home fans at this match, we want them to see that we can beat them regularly. As far as I can see, when I look at this, and I think about it in retrospect, this is kind of classic participatory design project. And all the better for it. But what are the qualities of it? And now think about the critical points I've made up to now. The invitation is by the designer. So you get to participate if he invites you to participate. The relationship, there's a lot of fun in it. But it goes through those kind of professional stages of the design workshop, then some field work, something is designed, and there's some kind of evaluation. And the fans are involved essentially on my terms if I'm running the project. They can, of course, break the rules, but essentially I'm setting conditions for what works in the project if I'm the designer. And what are they? What's their subject position in this? And by subject position, I mean both how are they seen by the designer, how would they be seen, you know, if you were to look at what they're doing from the outside. And actually, and he did talk to some of them afterwards, how did they see themselves? And they saw themselves as informants, basically. So they weren't designing anything, they didn't think they were co-designing or designing in a participatory way, they were informants. And the potential for action was essentially that they could feed into the design of this artifact. And they could have fun with it and enjoy it, and again, a good thing. So this is the baseline. This is the kind of participatory design project which has a fairly clearly understood structure, and I know they're not all like this. I picked this one because it's one that I was a little bit involved in, and I just put it out there as having these qualities. Okay? And the other two, I'm going to say, have quite different qualities. And I think it's not that there's participation in one and not participation in another. Remember earlier I said about kind of different forms or genres of participation? I think that's what I want to do. Is I want to show you that there's participation, and then there's a different kind of participation, and then there's a different kind of participation as well. So the second project I'm going to talk about is a project called the Angelou Centre Project, which was run by a Newcastle researcher called Rachel Clark. Rachel's background was in community-based art, and she was doing a PhD in what was then called Culture Lab and what's now called Open Lab in University of Newcastle. And at the time, when it was Culture Lab, what they were well known for was these kinds of arts-inspired, small, interesting, provocative projects, where often the collaborations within the project would be between the Culture Lab people, some artists, some people who are socially active, and the community of interest. And as they grew, pretty much all of those stakeholders became part of the lab. So you had artists doing PhD, and Rachel was one of those PhD in the science department. You would have social activists in there as well, and some of you will know some of them. And that's the background from which this project comes. So what they wouldn't be inclined to do here, partly because of the kinds of areas in which they do the projects, is they wouldn't do what Room did. They wouldn't do it for a number of reasons, which I hope will become clear as I talk about this project. Essentially, and this is the kind of methodologist in me, the kind of psychology background training on research methods and stuff, they wouldn't do it because it wouldn't be the appropriate thing to do in this situation. Okay? And I hope you'll see why in a minute. So the project was very ill-defined at the start, by which I mean Rachel's PhD supervisor, my good friend Pete Wright, said, the Angelou Centre wants us to do something, go on out and do something. And it was almost as clear as that. Rachel lived near the Angelou Centre. The Angelou Centre was in a part of Newcastle where you have significant migrant population. So lots of people who were originally African, lots of Asian people, and some Newcastle folk living in there as well. So it's kind of mixed, working class, but a decent sized migrant population. The Angelou Centre, as might be clear from the name, was explicitly set up to help people who migrated into Newcastle to settle in. So the whole raison d'etre was to create activities that would enable people to integrate. Rachel was doing a PhD in computer science. The director of the Angelou Centre thought the women in the centre would benefit from some training in application. Teach them a bit of Word, teach them a bit of Facebook or PowerPoint or whatever. It'll be good for their CVs. So Rachel went out and tried this kind of stuff for a while and offered little workshops or individual tuition or whatever, and nobody came along. And after a couple of weeks or a few weeks of this, she went back and spoke to the person who ran the centre, who herself was an African woman. So it's not like it was a kind of a Newcastle business person imposing a particular worldview on what was going on. It was just a pragmatic, here's what might be useful. So Rachel went back to work, and this poor woman was tearing her hair out at this stage because she had asked the university to get involved. She didn't know what they should be doing. And she said to Rachel, just try to do something. So that's the second time she was told, just try to do something. So Rachel hung out there for a while with women, and accidentally found that on one of the days that she didn't spend there, so she used to go out a regular 2 days a week, I can't remember which days, but one week she went out a different day, and discovered this was the day where they had cookery classes. And they taught each other their cuisines, if you like. So she decided the best way to work in this area, the best way to get to know them, the best way to become part of the group in some way, though she was kind of, as somebody who had years' experience as a community-based artist, she knew she couldn't quite be on the inside, but to become part of the group in some way was to take part in the cookery classes. So she's become one of the best Asian cooks I know. She did this for about 3 months, and during the 3 months, they got to know each other, they got to kind of trust her, and something that looked more conventionally like a project then could start. But as far as Rachel was concerned, that project started 3 months ago. You couldn't do what was to come next if you had gone through what had just happened. So, the big challenge, in retrospect, when she would talk about this, she'd said the big challenge was essentially creating a space where the women in the centre felt secure enough to define a role for themselves. They were sick of people telling them what to do. They were sick of people telling them where they should go, where they should live, and so on. And now, here are skills you need to develop. And in this case, the background was you're trying to create some kind of intervention that will help the community belongs. And you're doing that by coming in and telling them what to do. So, one of the lessons she learned, I don't know how generalisable it is, but it was true for this project, is that to design for community belonging, we need to learn to belong in that community. We need to be there in a way that's different from the kind of standard presence that most of us would have if we were doing field work or whatever in a centre. And one of her conclusions was, as she did this, was the women were alienated from any notion of the university, public services, research. They didn't know what research was, they were frightened by the idea, and so on. And what she, not what she did for that 3 months, what happened over that 3 months is they began to stumble on things that were sensible things for them to do in this community belonging project, and that they could all contribute to it, and that they all felt some sense of ownership around it. And what it amounted to was a bit of art, and a bit of technology, and a bit of their cultural background and so on. So everybody had a say in what would happen next. And essentially, Rachel kind of put herself out there in the same way as they were teaching her to cook. She said, look, I can show you some things as well. What would you like to do? And one or two of them put themselves forward and said, I take lots of photographs and I don't know how to put them on a computer. So there was a way in to kind of digital photography and so on. Some others made little videos. Some others did fairly standard craft work, and Rachel helped them with that. So essentially, they did what they were comfortable doing, and that became the focus of the intervention here. During the early stages of the project, Rachel wrote about this 6 or 8 months afterwards. She said she felt totally lost. Now, this is the first 3 months, but it's probably the next 3 months as well. Totally confused, overwhelmed, overstimulated, getting so many ideas from different people in the centre. What do I do? Do I satisfy the manager of the centre who really thinks she needs to make a report to the local council on the skills that these women are learning? The university, we're requirement for a PhD. I was talking about this PhD. Anybody doing a PhD for years? And satisfy the women and the needs that Rachel felt were being expressed to her by them, and also she's in there. And she's an artist designer. How does she satisfy herself? And looking back over it, she started thinking about useful ways to kind of talk about that project and so on that I'm appropriating a little bit here. Here are the kinds of things that came out of it. And I need to give you a tiny bit more background to explain this. These are two of the women who took a series of photographs, which were thematically kind of coherent and made a very nice presence at an exhibition that they had at the end of about 8 months' work. In these photos, they always dressed the same. They were really, really good friends. They had 2 little families and their kids mixed together and so on. But the identification with each other was tangible, visible, material, and so on. Bit of background. The Angelo Centre is a centre for women who have been domestically abused. Okay? They wanted to express themselves. The way they talked about it, the words I'm using may not have been their words, won't have been their words, but they wanted to express themselves. They wanted to find a way of saying, this is me, I'm here, I'm at you. Okay? They didn't want to give their identities away. Because one of the most important things for them, they were living in sheltered accommodation at the time. They were in this sheltered hospital, the Angelo Centre, because they were trying to keep a distance from their extended family. Okay? The source of the abuse. And they found a way to do it. Now, Rachel didn't give them this, she just showed them how to kind of digitally crop photographs and things like that. And they came up with some absolutely beautiful stuff through doing it. And there was an exhibition at the end of this project, which included this, and I'll show you one other one in a minute to make a slightly different point, where this was thematically strong across the whole thing. I want to find a way to express myself, but not to identify myself. Which, if you think about it, is a very hard challenge for any designer. And the idea that there's an ethical onus on you in this project to protect the identity of the people and at the same time to give them the means to express themselves. Sometimes we talk about giving people a voice. I prefer to think of it as people already have a voice, we just need to listen to it. If I say I give them a voice, I take the power in some way. Actually, they have a voice, we just don't listen most of the time. So this is listening and responding. Huma went through, most of the women through the 3 or 6 months of the project were stuck in the same situation at the end as they were at the beginning. So it didn't make a huge difference to their lives other than they found some way of expressing themselves. They were still in sheltered accommodation maybe. Some of them were beginning to get housed at that stage. Feeling insecure, fearful, and so on. Wanting to join in with each other, but feeling some tensions there as well. Same as in all areas of life. The place you have to go is the Angelo Centre, because that's where the activities are. You let some people there, you don't let some people there. So there are tensions. But lots of your friends are there, lots of your support network is there, so you go there. Huma was an interesting kind of example out of this. She was in a fairly desperate state at the start, and the way in which she was talking about the centre and so on, would wonder how difficult her situation was and what the outcome might be. And by the end of it, and again, no claim that this is to do with the project or the skills that Rachel taught her, but just, I think, being involved and coming out of herself a little bit more, she just felt more positive about life. Not hugely positive, but she definitely would talk about having had some kind of a journey where there's some kind of a change at the end of it. And these are snippets from a video she did, where the last leaves of autumn really were kind of ironically or paradoxically hopeful for her. So she wrote pieces to go with the video, and it's the hopefulness that was coming out at the end. Okay, now, here's the kind of methodological bit again. So you think back on that project, and the invitation is not very clear. It's not that the designer invited them to join in the project. I think I want to argue that there's some kind of reciprocal arrangement. They kind of agreed and they fell into it. And it's negotiated throughout the project. If any one of them wanted to withdraw, that was fine. What they wanted to do in the project within the terms of what was possible to do, that was fine. Rachel was happy to facilitate and help with that. But Rachel, and I think a couple of you might know her, Rachel is very clear as well. So it's not like the designer becomes that sponge who takes it all in. Rachel would be very clear about what she could do and what she thought would be useful to do and so on. So she would have an active role in this as well, and a kind of dialogue between them, not a kind of you're providing me with a service. The relationships bit was focused on lived experience, not on a particular slice of it, and not on the information that comes out of that slice, but on the actual experience of being a woman in that centre in Newcastle at that time, stuck in the way they were stuck, and trying to move on from there. And I think, and I'm stealing this idea from somebody else as well, I want to describe it as people living in a kind of a space of in-between belonging. A feminist anthropologist, Elizabeth Probin, writes about that state of in-between belonging, where you belong, but you belong in a space which is kind of moving, and it's not here, and it's not there, but you feel you belong to them. So it's that space of in-between belonging that was characteristic of this project. And there was huge tolerance for uncertainty and multiple voices. That was the whole point of the project as it developed. That's not what it started out. It started out in the very pragmatic ways that I described earlier. But the important thing about this project, in terms of thinking about participatory projects, is how it developed. And how it became a conversation and a negotiation, and multiple voices were heard, and something interesting came out of that. And I suppose the potential that came out of it then was people making a project together. People being able to express themselves, which is one of the things that they expressly said they wanted to do, when within this project they were able to do that. Okay? It may be that they went out the door and they weren't again. But hopefully it gives some kind of power to people when they get the opportunity to do it. And they're doing it in their way to the extent that the situation allowed it. So the technology wasn't there, the skills weren't there, they couldn't do it. And again, so it was real life in that sense. It's not a fantasy where everything was really available. And when I think about participation here, this in-between belonging, so I think participation in the first example involves a kind of an identification. We're all fans together. Okay? And what's going on is information exchange. In this case, it's not identification. We're quite different from each other. But we kind of belong together in this situation. And that's all I mean by approximate belonging. We kind of belong together in this situation. And it might be temporary, as it happens in this case, but that's just because of who she is and what she does. Rachel still works in this centre, and she lives near it, so she volunteers there. But most of the women she worked with are gone. Okay? So it's that kind of approximate in belonging. And I think if I think about what Rachel did in this situation, so what the designer did in this situation, is they kind of reframed everything that was possible by dissolving the frame that already existed. So they undid the structure that was there, and by that I mean the structure for a PhD. It was a big risk of this. The structure for a PhD, forget it. I'm not going to do that. I can hear her telling me this. And her supervisor is probably my best friend, and I thought, oh, shit, how am I going to tell Pete this? And I didn't. Because Rachel would go and tell him before I did, when I was sweating about it. And she just said, no, I can't do it that way. I'm going to do it this way. And he worried about it and lost sleep over it. She did a brilliant PhD. But in that situation, what she did really was very structured. If you go back to Beach, she actually said, okay, the invitation here is for all of us. I'm here if you invite me. I invite you to join in this activity with me, and I really want us to get something out of it. We'll all decide what the something is. And by allowing the women to have their own power and express their own identities and show their own expertise in the situation, there's a redistribution of the sensitive as well. So whose voices get heard is fairly atypical. Migrant voices don't always get heard. Women's voices don't always get heard, and so on. So there's a redistribution of the sensible there, which is not what Rachel would have been thinking of at the time. That's not the way, but she would have been from her community-based art stuff. She worked quite a lot in the kind of abandoned mining areas in the north of England, where unemployment went from almost nothing to 80% within a couple of years, and areas became entirely impoverished. So she would have been aware of the sensitivities and the need to make sure that people felt they could say what they needed to say and so on. And I would argue that in doing that, there's then a redistribution of whose voice matters, and all their voices matter, that's the point, including Rachel's. Who gets heard? The invitation is not issued from one side to the other, there's some reciprocality around it. And this is a different kind of participation to the participation in the first project. And here's a little additional point on this one. And it comes out in her PhD. It was a very, very hard PhD to write. So if any of you are doing PhDs and you're thinking of doing it this way, be prepared for that. A lot of sweat at the end. This is the cost in terms of PhD. How do you write a project like this, where the point in design terms wasn't to take these women's experience and represent it in some way for design? It was actually to keep their experience alive in the design process. You write that down. And it's very, very hard. And it leads to very unwieldy chapters that externs say, can you not tidy that up, and so on. But you make the case. What I'm trying to do here is convey to you the experience as it was at that time. I'm trying to bring this voice into the pieces and so on. So keeping experience alive is one of the things that became important for us in the book, because it ran through a number of the projects that we felt were kind of powerful, and not just ones we did, other ones that we felt were kind of powerful and needed to be out there. Instead of thinking of these projects as, well, maybe as well as, because I'm including banner back in this, but as well as that, some of them are not going to have the quality of, I'm going out into the field to get information, to bring it back, to represent it in some way, to feed into requirements, to design something, and then put it out in the background. In this case, I'm going out there, work with these people, see what we can come up with, and what we come up with is what we come up with, and the point is, when I'm thinking as a designer, I need to keep that experience alive for myself. So go back to the spectator in the theatre now, and it's the live experience that makes the difference here. Very hard to do. I don't think I'd be able to do it. I'm not creative enough to do that and stuff. But I think that's what we need to do. Because voices in the past are just it. Voices that are alive make an impact. Okay. Third and final project. The area that I'm working in myself with my PhD students for the last 5 or 6 years is dementia care. Okay? So most people who work in dementia in psychology are doing very cognitive and very neuroscience-y kind of work. And that's great, and I have no problem with that. It's just not my thing. And part of the reason for that, I suppose, is I'm not patient enough. Because I think whatever kind of intervention, chemical or neural or whatever, that will work in time to sustain memory for longer for people whose memories are fading, will take years and years and years and years to come. It's very experimental, which is not my thing. And in a way, the bit of me that wants kind of immediate gratification is the bit of me that says, actually, what's important for most of the people that I know who are either caring for somebody with dementia, or one or two that I know who have or had dementia, and when I say had, they've died, is that they have a decent quality of life now. Okay? So that's the field in which my PhDs have been working for the last few years. And they've done projects where they spend, and take Rachel as a model now, and to be fair, they would have. They spend time in areas where dementia care is relevant. So one of them, for example, our PhD was working with individuals in their homes who were in the fairly early stages of dementia, needed support, trying to help work out what support they needed, and how services could be designed, or technologies could be designed to help give that care and provide that support. And she worked very closely for 3 to 4 years with half a dozen women, about 6, I think, all together. They were Dublin, sorry. I'll have to get out of the Rachel mode now. With half a dozen people, 2 of whom died during the project, and others of whom got worse and worse and worse. One was fairly stable and didn't progress very much in terms of dementia. So that was Mary Galvin. Kelly Morrissey worked in Ireland what's an old community home system. So I don't know whether you have the equivalent here. These would be kind of municipally run care facilities for older people going back years. We used to call them community homes. And they ran basically on a medical model. And they, partly because the buildings have gotten older and less functional, they've kind of faded out and people do things differently now. And partly because of the times we live in, a lot of that has been privatised. So private care facilities now. So these community homes became the place where people could afford to go to a private facility if you have dementia. Which is fairly pathetic when you think about it. Not good enough for anybody else, but good enough for people with dementia. So she worked in that kind of a setting, and she worked in a daycare centre as well, where people would come for engagement and support and social activities a couple of days a week, and some of them were just old and needed social engagement, and some of them were at the early stages of developing dementia. And through a process not unlike Rachel's, she designed a little thing called, I already said banner battle, Swade Band, which was a really simple piece of technology based on a Wii controller, which essentially got people swinging together, dancing, moving, singing, and so on. And I have the video if you want to see it in a minute. But there was a kind of an ultimate hack moment there, because she was struggling to think, what's the intervention here? She got to know the people very well, they got to know her, they were working on things together, but she was getting nowhere in terms of design. And she took some of them one night to this concert given by a group called Purple Pops. And Purple Pops had something to do with dementia, but she wasn't sure what it was. So she thought it was maybe a voluntary group that would entertain people with dementia. It was actually a group of people with dementia entertaining the rest of us. And one of the things they did was they had a big length of silk like cloth I don't know what it really was, but it looked silkish. And they swayed holding it. So they could sway pretty much in rhythm with each other, holding that. And the Wii controller was a way of kind of simulating that, where a light would come on if there were two hands on it, and the light would get brighter or more colourful the more they swayed. And that was published in one of the ACM conferences last year or the year before, if you're interested in it. I'm going to talk about the most recent project. So this is a PhD student, and I'm picking this one, not because it's better than the other two, but the newest one is always better. But essentially because it pushes the boundaries of participation even further. Okay? It is the best example from amongst my projects of how you take range instruction and you push it even further. Okay? So this student's name is Sarah Foley, and having supervised 3 PhDs who work with dementia, 2 of them with kind of the HCI spin on it. And Sarah came along and said, John, I'd like to do a PhD with you, and I want to work in dementia. One of the reasons I became interested in dementia is my wife's mother had dementia for about the last 7 or 8 years of her life, and it got gradually worse. And initially, it was just a bit of forgetting, and by the end, there were kind of bits of paranoia and real fear and anxiety when a character on the television would seem to her to be the noise that she heard outside her window and all of this kind of stuff. And this is fairly typical. She didn't become very bad. She was able to live at home most of the time. So a lot of people with dementia develop these kind of paranoid elements as well. So you watch the telly, and just think how easy it is to think, I'm going to get a piece of phone, turn on the telly, and let her watch it. And there's something violent on the telly, and she's absolutely terrified the whole night through them, because she thinks it's here in the room, not on the telly. And that's a real experience. And what worked with Maura in terms of just giving her the piece, and to be fair, giving us the piece, was the cheapest digital photo frame you could think of, where we sat down and we essentially created playlists, and we taught her about what photos she liked looking at, and so on. So we did a bit of participatory design, and we did the playlists to suit what she liked looking at. So there's a whole. She has one grandson. She died a few years ago. She has one grandson, and there's a whole playlist around Philip. And I was worried that this might be like, putting the children in front of television to let the telly mind them for a while. And actually it turned out to be something totally different. She had some agency. She was able to control the playlists, and when she reached a point where she wasn't able to, she would say to us or to 1 or 2 carers who used to come into her, I want to see such and such one. So she would name the playlists and they would move them around for her. So at that point, I had very much had enough. And I said to Sarah, I'm not sure I want to do anymore. And anyway, I said, you're too young to get involved with people who have dementia and so on. Do something that's a bit more fun for yourself. And part of it was I was afraid that, another one on top of the other ones that we had kind of drained whatever was to be learned from those projects. So it would be ultimately frustrating for her. But she said, but I've been volunteering in that area for the last 3 or 4 years. That meant from about 14, she was in dementia care facilities, working with people with dementia. And there was no family connection or anything like that. I mean, I look at her and I think, God, you're impressive. Because when I was 14, that's not what I was doing. And here's the best of it. I said, okay, so what angle do you want to take on this? So this is a couple of meetings later, when we've agreed it's going to get, so what kind of angle do you want to take? Well, I do my voluntary work in the area where the most advanced cases are. So what's the kind of bedroom? If they're going down to the community area, they have to be taken down the wheelchair. And I just thought, this is going to end unhappily. And happily it has. One of the things that she hooked on very early on, there's this in dementia care, up to probably late 1980s, early 1990s, it was treated almost entirely as a medical issue. So drugs, maintenance, and so on. As occupational therapists became more involved in it, academic occupational therapists working with practicing occupational therapists did some really interesting research which led to a model of care called person-centered care. Surprise, surprise. And they came up with things like a list of, I think it's defined in terms of care needs, but essentially here are the things you should do with a person with dementia. And the first one on the list is recognition. And Sarah came in to me one day and she said, I think they've got that wrong. What do you mean? I said, look at what's in there. It's all about when you go into the room, you should talk to the person in their name. You should identify them. You should recognize them. You should remember something from yesterday and all that. I said, yeah, sounds good, doesn't it? And she said, but what about the person behind you? What about them recognizing you? Isn't that important as well? Isn't the mutuality of this important? And that's what she started for. So the argument here, the kind of theoretical bit behind it, is from social recognition theory, which is the kind of theory that's used in lots of critical discourses. So people active against racism or people active against sexism or whatever will very often talk about things like misrecognition. So I'm not recognized for myself, I'm recognized in terms of the stereotype that somebody has of me. So that's the flip side of it. So this is, how do we engage people with dementia in being able to recognize the person who comes in to look after them and being able to talk to them about things that matter to you in a way which is mutual rather than just kind of playing a game, sometimes an important game, where I'm recognizing them and going through the motions in doing it. And the background for this is really good stuff out of people like Luria and Vygotsky and various others who very, very early on noticed that the important thing in terms of the development of strong identity and sense of self was social recognition. There are more contemporary kind of theories of this in psychology and lots of good empirical work on perspective exchange. So me being able to get your perspective, you being able to get my perspective, and how important that is in terms of me understanding myself as some kind of rounded human being. And apparently developmentally, it's not until we can do that that we begin to understand ourselves as selves. Just again, a tiny little bit of background here. The social validation, I think the only important thing about this is recognition, one way, mutual recognition. Then what happens in the services with respect to recognition, and it's very, very confusing. And where Sarah has gone with now is in terms of citizenship. So, interestingly, people with dementia weren't really treated as citizens. They were on the register of electors, but nobody would think of having them out to vote. And if you said it in a care facility, people would laugh at you on stage. So now there's a movement saying, well, hang on, Maura has a right to vote. And that's only one kind of citizenship, me being treated as a citizen, not just as a person, not just as a self, but as a citizen, is important in all of this. Part of what Sarah did was a design ethnography, where she did a really interesting thing here as well. So she had spent a lot of time in this facility. She continued to do so and take notes. She paid particular attention to kind of embodied moments of recognition. So a key thing here is very often it's not the words, because what is definitely declining for a person with dementia is their cognitive state. Okay? No doubt about that. This is not about bringing people back from something which is in inevitable decline. Nonetheless, they do a lot non-verbally that was being entirely ignored. So touch, feel, all of those kinds of things. And I'm only going to linger on this one because I'm aware of time running away. Things like the nurse came in then, and I took her hand to say goodbye. This is Sarah saying goodbye to the woman that she'd been working with for the afternoon. She gave me such a big smile and gripped my hand for a long time. It felt like she was clinging to me for reassurance that we would both there. Now this is Sarah saying this. So there is methodologically a kind of, there's that strong internal development in this. But it comes from being with that woman week after week after week for years. And hearing her express real anxiety about who I am, where I am, what's going on, and so on. And one of the things that's most important for her, excuse me, is the only way I can express it is her own autonomy. So she and a number of others talk about not being able to do the things they used to be able to do, not being able to cook, not being able to do things for her family when they come and visit, and so on. So the ethnography is at this kind of level. And what Sarah did then, because it was becoming a bit too big, is she brought a load of third year BA, not a load, small number, third year BA students and master's students, groups of 3. That became her kind of assistant. She organised all of this herself. This is part of their project work as well. And they go out and they work with these women as well. And typically now they work with women in the centre, but not always. And they started doing, skip that one, they started doing things like this. Little design projects where here they're designing a prototype mental box. So the standard practice in dementia care, in terms of keeping the experience of remembering alive, so there is a practice there, is the life story book. Now think about that for a minute. Cognitive decline, communication difficulties, memory problems, life story book. And this is the standard practice. So people with dementia are very good with things. They're not very good with words. They're not very good at communicating verbally. So these guys have started working around objects and things that happen to them, finding ways of keeping them and interacting with them that will be meaningful to the person with dementia. Okay. This is the one when I sat down to do this. I've had the same slide at the end of each of these now. I find it really hardest to do. And I would be very interested in any feedback here. Because there's a basic question here. Is the person with dementia participating at all? Well, I want to argue they are. Right? Why is this different from the kind of verbal, ethnography notes, or in some cases verbal protocols, that Sarah would have collected? Why is it different? We do all the ethics stuff. There's consent involved. There's a strict process of consent involved here. One of the arguments is we don't recognise them as citizens. Well, surely they have a right to participate. But anybody here could perfectly validly say there's some threshold they haven't gone through here for participation. I want to see it the other way. The invitation, here's where it gets pushed very far. The invitation has to be worked on every single visit. Okay? Because there's no guarantee that anything that happened the last day is going to be remembered today. Experience has to be kept alive because it doesn't exist in any other. It's not there in memory now. There's definitely strong examples of caring and mutual caring going on here. And just quickly reading through some of the field notes make it clear. And there's a very strong, in both directions, embodied sensual kind of language. So there's something about people with advanced dementia, I'm generalizing, from probably half a dozen, where the sensory things like the touch and what you hear and so on may be a side effect of kind of higher cognitive system shutting down, which is the more capacity to the lower cognitive system. I don't know. But they definitely are more aware of the sensory stuff that's going on around them, and they both appreciate it and sometimes are frightened. This is the hardest one of all for me anyway. Every single visit, Sarah and the little team she has working with her want there to be co-op. So is that enough to say there's co-op? I don't think so. But there's definitely something going on there. And there's definitely a responsibility. There's definitely responding to the ways in which somebody with dementia uses or doesn't use or can remember or can't remember what's going on. And it's impossible to find out how the participants see themselves. It would be like Rachel's concern about research being an alien thing for the women she's doing. Just even asking that question would make no sense. One of the things that's happening here is because the memory is going, arguably, the fragmented sense of self is starting to appear. There is another way of looking at that. The word fragmented is a problem in that sense. A different kind of sense of self is appearing. We all have many voices going on. We argue with ourselves all the time. Maybe it's just that people with dementia are more open about that because they have no editor. There's definitely a kind of making a project together, and there's definitely a sense in which the person with dementia leads that very often. But that's only because when Sarah and began going, they would wait patiently to find out what the person wants to do. Most occupational therapists and nurses would say they don't have time to do that, and they probably don't. So this one pushes all the boundaries for me as a participatory project, and I still want to call it a participatory project because I don't know how else you would do participatory work here, but I'd be very interested in hearing what you think. Yeah.
I was also thinking in terms of who is allowed to be there, because I'm thinking probably the relationships between like the researcher and the other people. I don't know, was there tension in the relationship? Were they stable relationship? I'm thinking
The relationships between person with dementia, the people with different people with dementia, and
well,
Sarah.
was it Sarah?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking like if a new person
Yeah.
entering the context
Yeah.
would create additional tension and would break the relationships
Yeah.
that have been nurtured. up to
So
that point.
typically, so it's groups of 3 or 4, and typically they work with different people with dementia. I'm going to keep saying different women because almost all the cases in field notes are women, and it's just easier than saying people with dementia in a sentence. So Sarah will be working probably with the same couple of people for a year or more, and Louise will work with the same person for 6 or 8 months or whatever, but they're different people from each other. So there has to be that kind of continuity for it to work. But you make a very good point. I think it's a feature of people with very advanced dementia. I think they've gone past the aggressive and kind of paranoid phase. The issue here is passivity. They could just lie in bed and done. Okay? They're not going to be fighting shadows for the most time. So it is a different scenario to the previous one that Kelly would have been dealing with. But it could easily go wrong, absolutely. So
yeah, well,
everybody has.
it doesn't have to be very extreme, but also in
No,
terms of trust.
no. But yeah, so if you remember at the very start, I said she wanted to work with the most advanced cases. So they work on a particular floor in the centre where everybody is pretty much not bedridden. That's not fair because they are brought down to the communal centre. Even when they're brought down to the communal centre, they don't have food. So to get the level of engagement that's going on there requires exactly what you're thinking there. You have to be there very, very regularly. And there is some kind of mutual recognition goes on. So they do seem to recognise Sarah when she comes in and the others. But I think it's exactly for the reason you said. The same person is coming in a couple of times a week, or week after week after week. I think it would be very confusing if it was different.
I'm very empathic to this kind of boundary pushing and so. I simply don't have the fantasy of how I could possibly frame this before an ethical committee. Up front.
Yeah.
How did you do it?
It's very, very difficult. So there's a thing called the mental capacity act, and we follow that very closely. Every time you win, so the negotiation, so this is not just the niceties of it, this is doing the ethics every single visit. So this is sitting down with Mary and saying, do you know who I am now, Mary? Yeah. Do you remember that I'm here from the university and that I'm doing that? Yeah. And there's an occupational therapist or a nurse with her at the same time. And the three of them have to agree at the start of every session that Mary understands well enough what's going on. Her family will have had a say in it back at the start and every so often after that. So there's a kind of a ethical consent by proxy.
But the point here is really, of course, you have this every time. But there's also a dynamic. And the ethical committee basically asks you, you have to make sure this is upfront happening. Which you can't basically because there is a dynamic going on. And you don't know exactly what the status is on Tuesday or next week's
That's
Tuesday.
right. But that's true of almost any field work. So if you're going to work in a particular community where there are problems or there are extremely wealthy people with apparently no problems, you don't know what's going to happen. You know, it's all unpredictable in that sense. My position on it, something interesting has happened in the UK, where they're turning down almost every ethics application around dementia because they become nervous about what they're talking about. Not now the out-and-out medical ones, but the social ones. My position on that is that's a disaster. Because what it will do is it cause a ghetto where nobody can do any research, so nobody can push these boundaries forward. And I think there always has to be a balance there, and there's a risk. So if I'm doing research in a school with kids, I need parents' consent, I need teachers' consent, I need some kind of consent from the child, but who knows whether that child knows what they're doing in these areas, you know? So it's a bit like that, and there are checks built in all over the place. And it has to be done every single visit. Okay, getting there. And everything that goes on in this project is really about those tiny clues. So it's very often body stuff, it's very often touch, it's very often fragments of things that are said, rather than big statements. And what kind of participation is going on here? I think this is probably the most profound of all of them in that sense, because I think it's basically, it's kind of existential. And that's not because we're doing great research, it's because we're dealing with an existential issue. What kind of an existence is dementia? And the first one here I think speaks to your point about the ethics and consent and so on. We're exploring forms and understandings of belonging with people who are definitely have rights, definitely are citizens, definitely are being treated in a very person-centered way and all this. No doubt about it though, they're outside the kind of normal range. And opens up notions of what community might become there. So the typical way in any country that I'm aware of for caring for these people is in separate individual rooms. And again, I don't know. I'm not sure that's the cleverest thing, but it might be. If I was spending weeks in a unit like this, and they were all making each other, because of slightly uncontrolled behaviour, anxious. There's something to be said for this separation and privacy, but I think a lot is lost in doing that as well. There is definitely a kind of an ongoing sense of reassuring that we're both here, that cohesion. It's not that these people are being given a voice, it's that Sarah is bending over backwards to recognise their voice. So the recognition thing in Kitwood's care model goes in one direction. Sarah is absolutely stretching every fibre of her being to find a way to have the recognition come the other direction as well.
so that the person with dementia, their moments of recognizing you for who you are is recognized. Okay? But it's hard. Finding ways to bring those active voices to the fore and keeping them live in dialogue, because they don't exist in memory a few days later. And that's that point as well. Okay, to wrap it up, there are the questions I put up at the start. So you think about the projects that I've just gone through. Is participation voluntary? Well, we've just discussed that in that last phase. And it's different in the 3 projects. And I'm going to say that for lots of these things now. And I'm saying it because I think there isn't one thing called participatory or participation in HCI or in any other area. There are lots of different things. I think Liam Bannon was absolutely right to make a distinction between human-centred and human-involved. And I think now there's an appropriate time to start being more nuanced about different forms of participation as well as being definitely. But she will sit there for 2 hours while they sleep. She will wait for them to say what they want and so on. She'll wait for them to kind of indicate that they're ready to talk or whatever. So maybe actually, and by whom, and I think push it and push it and push it. And in a way, in the book, and what I want to say now, is that they are different kind of, I want to call them genres of participation. And I think they're classifiable in coherent kind of wholes that could be used methodologically as well. At the end of this, in a couple of slides, I wanted to kind of ask myself, well, is participation a good thing? Why do we all do this participation? Don't forget, Dave Beach and 1 or 2 others in the art world have written about participation as a tyranny. Now, they write about it that way because of the possibility that we, as the art or theatre audience, are being forced into doing something we don't want to do. Well, that's possible through any of the project. And ethics is a good process in all of that. But there's some quality judgment has to go on as well to try and make sure that it's not a tyranny, that people aren't being forced to do what they don't want to do, given that somebody wants their research project finished as well. What's the value of these projects at the end of the day? Well, to my mind, and this is towards the end of the book, a kind of a big word for us, to my mind, the value of these participatory projects is the variety of voices. It's dissensus. So think about dissensus as not the opposite of consensus, but different from consensus. If consensus is we all come to a single position, dissensus is there's no need to come to a single position. The point of the project is that we embrace all positions. Okay? And we couldn't do that unless there was consensus on doing that in the first place. So it's not, some people read consensus and dissensus as antagonistic towards each other, they're not. Dissent is just that we do not need consensus. These projects all work better when everybody's voices are heard, or at least when a variety of voices are heard. And any attempt to average them out or to come to a single position on them just kills some voices. The biggest strength or the biggest value of these projects is that people are invited to use their voices. I've talked about that. So, actually I've pretty much talked about this as well in talking about the census. Critical thing for participatory projects is,
I just realized that no one has actually taken any of the
I'll be finished in 2 minutes, and I'm happy for people to get through that as I'm finishing. So the critical dialogue then is in the invitation to be yourself, to use your voice, and then in the follow-through of it. If the project says, no, we're not talking about that, we're talking about this, then somebody is being shut down. If it's a participatory project, then they have as much right as me to shape the project.
Equally, I as much right as them to shape the project. Okay? So, the census, I think, is the critical thing. I kind of wanted to wrap it up with an example of the census. HCI starts by putting psychology and computer science together in the 1960s. What a mad project. If there were two groups of people talking about quite different things in the 1960s, information processing, computer systems, and somehow a group of people got continued like that forever. So sociology, anthropology comes in, drama, theatre, art, and so on, and somehow they all get heard. And look, to finish with formula, but there is none. I always think it's a good idea to finish a talk. The only kind of formula, and the examples I gave, I can show some of that. You really have to be involved and care about the lives of the other to be involved in this at all. And I think if you do, you want to change the whole thing. Yeah, and again, I think it is, instead of, so most of the methods that I'm aware of in those areas would look for things like activism. Okay? So most work on democracy is survey-based. So it's not going to pay much attention to diversity of voice. It's going to try to even things out and say such a percentage of people are this now and such a percentage of people are this. Or people who are in this camp attached to the following three things or whatever. So it's going to be some kind of averaging process. So that's at one extreme. And then in UX design, very often what's done is a version of that. Very often what's done is a kind of a standardized, kind of heuristic approach to going in, finding out what's going on by the kind of game plan that you have. So you have slots you want to fill in, and then going out and making the system better by feeding in the information from the slots, the information slots you fit it in. And that's a useful thing, but that's not what these projects are. So the difference here is that the key thing that drives them is not averages or similarities or I've got the magic bullet, I know the answer to this question. What drives them is difference. And that's one of the reasons that it's important for me to finish up saying in the talk, the technology is secondary, because very often technology doesn't come out of these projects. What you learn about is the process. So I think seeing them as software development, seeing this kind of stuff as software development tools would be a mistake. Yeah? Seeing it as trying to understand what technology will be in 10 years' time, and I'm talking about technology as a category and I'm not talking either about kind of predicting the future of the actual machine. I'm talking about technology defined as something like things in the world that I can use that are useful for me and that enrich my experience. A good friend of mine, a computer scientist, Alan Dix, once tried to convince me that his cat was a piece of technology because functionally it did everything that a piece of technology would do. Okay? And actually that's not a million miles away from what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a kind of a very basic research process. This is not as applied as lots of the other stuff I do. So the individual projects are as applied as they can be. But what I'm trying to do here is to say, and if we imagine 10 years out, or 20 years out, and if we take this participatory stuff seriously, what kind of a world are we likely to end up in? Well, my little nightmare scenario at the moment is around robots. Okay? Not because I have any problem with robots, but I don't want a robot looking after my mother if she gets dementia. Not because of any bias or prejudice or whatever against robots, but because developmentally, as a good developmental psychologist, developmentally, she's not prepared for that. Equally, I don't want a robot looking after any children. Because developmentally, they learn what it is to be a self from interacting with me, another human being. If they interact, significantly with robots, they will learn what it is to be a self by interacting with a robot.
I would agree, 100%.
So it's that kind of, it's imagining those kinds of things and thinking, why do we create care systems, individual care and so on, in a way which is so functional that maybe a robot could do it, and at the same time we'd be scared by the thought of a robot doing it. So it's those kinds of questions I think this kind of stuff might just provoke a little bit. Yeah? But it's not going to make any software. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm struggling a bit with these notions of equality and power, and also this relationship with the designer in this process,
Yeah.
and whether you can, to what extent you can actually achieve equality.
Yeah.
So in this process, you're talking about the sort of the early phases where you get sort of invited into it, and it's the actual design work is always about some transformation and change. It is like often it's this designer who has a certain power, especially if it's like technology mode. You will have the power. You will know that you have this means of change.
Yeah.
And the knowledge relates to what is possible. What is, so I'm just thinking, can you ever achieve that equality, or you will always have a certain agencies or certain powers having these means of knowing what can be done and also having that, coming in with that sort of role now.
I have a number of different kinds of responses buzzing around my head, so let me try and keep as many of them as I can. So one is the examples. One is those case studies. Now, you might want to argue, well, that's not the kind of design I'm talking about, because they're not committed to some kind of a design outcome from the very, very start. I say they are, but not to a piece of technology. If a prototype or a piece of technology comes out of it, good. If a process of engagement, participation, that might lead to people thinking about how services are delivered, so it becomes a service design project, is the outcome great? And I suspect in areas like dementia care, it's about service design rather than technology design. But most people will talk about having grown up with technology, so they will be just intimidated by most of them. So that's one kind of response. Another one is Microsoft. Full stop. Right? What designer made most of these systems? You know, they definitely didn't talk to me, and I doubt they talked to most of us who use them. And in making these projects and doing a proper kind of, I'd imagine, software design approach, taking a proper software design approach to it, have ended up, for example, with a system, this is a conversation I had with Ria yesterday, a system for communicating with people that's as horribly structured as this thing. And I use it because I can't find anything else that I can be sure of being able to connect to wherever I go. So that's powerful, and if designers do that, great, I don't do design. And I suppose the other one is again, it's the same kind of point about equality and similarity and difference. I'd say in any social situation, other than one where you actually have control over somebody through something like an employment contract, in almost any social situation, it's going to work better if people listen to each other. Okay? Whether that's a designer engaged, and the design, I definitely bore people who come at this when I talk about this kind of stuff in the more human science kind of anthropology kind of audiences, because I keep on emphasizing, and the designer has an important role and voice in all of this as well. So I'm not trying to play that down. I'm well aware that in these particular projects, it's questionable which design is really going on. Where was I going with that? So, the designer, really important voice in all of it, but unable to do anything, I'd say, unless they engage. as fully as possible, and these are examples of full engagement with people for whom they think they're designing. And I think, final point, if they go into a design situation, and I suspect most of Microsoft people do, if they go into a design situation with a question half answered anyway, I need a tool that's a bit like this other tool over here. I need something that will do what acetates used to do on a projector. Is anybody here old enough to remember acetates, yeah? Well, at least with an acetate, I could do drawings like that. I needed something that would do it. If you have half the answer when you go in already, yeah, you have the power, don't be new now, because I know you're looking for the power, but the designer has power in that situation over the outcome, but not over the engagement, and not over the value they get from whatever interaction they have with the participants. And then I think at the end of all of that, kind of go back to the point where I'm really aware. I think actually in each of these projects, some artifact came out of it, but very bespoke, probably only useful for a handful of people. But I'm kind of pleased artifacts have come out of those projects. And I wouldn't be entirely displeased if in any one of them, the PhD student or whoever said, John, I'm just kidding people if I come up with this over here. I prefer to say something about the kind of interaction that goes on between people when they're thinking about present life together, futures together, whether that could be useful in the design process. So I'm aware I'm pushing it very, very far.
We have time for maybe one more question. Then you and Anton need to go to the sound studio for
Oh God.
For some more talk.
Consider yourself a participant.
You're invited to take part.
And there was an exclamation mark.
Maria very kindly invited me last night. And we can certainly do that. I'll make you a counter offer. I'm very happy to do it now, but I'm on a meeting for tea or something beforehand. I think tomorrow morning is quiet, but I don't know whether you can get the studio in your room.
It depends on the
It's
like.
booked for 15:15.
There's a team set up as well. There's a
Ah,
person
right,
involved in it, so
right,
that's the
right.
thing.
Yeah.
So
But we should at least give them
I presume I can bring it in, can I?
yes, you can.
Okay, okay. Right, where was the one? Sorry. Is there one last question then?
Yeah, we were talking about this dissonance between psychology and computer science.
Yeah.
Now, many of the things you describe here, I kind of, I mean, it's not really ethnography, it's kind of going to that direction, more or less,
Yeah.
rather than psychology.
I'd say it's going beyond it. No?
Yeah.
I'd say why in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, but I was thinking, this HCI as it becomes been very, very strong in constructing these things that you're forced to use. And some people would say that both from one side and the other, that the outcome was maybe not the best in their view. Computer scientists would say, well, we lost some of the potential here, quite a lot of it. Maybe the psychology. So maybe if instead ethnography and computer science would have teamed up in the 60s, what do you think the outcome would be?
I think it would be a mess. And I wouldn't have got a job. I don't know. I think ethnography came along at the right time. And that's partly because I think sometimes bridging takes time. So whatever about the differences between them, psychology and computer science at least share the root metaphor. Information processing, computation and so on. Ethnography would have been miles away from that at the time. So it would have been a big, big reach. As I understand it, the kind of tens of people who put it together at the start, and it was tens, it wasn't even hundreds, were teaching on each other's programs. So there was an organic element to this. I think it's a much better discipline for having sociology in there, and ethnography in there, and art in there, and so on, because it's an applied discipline where you should throw everything you can at it in as sensible and useful a way as you possibly The ethnography point is an interesting one. And again, I've been talking to a couple of people in the last year or so about making. I was thinking about this last night, and I was thinking about ethnography, and Tim Ingold. Have you read this book?
Yes.
Yeah. So his point about ethnography and anthropology, I think, is very relevant here as well. So ethnography for Tim Ingold is essentially a process of documentation. Okay? Anthropology, which we all think of, or I think of anyway, as the root discipline for ethnography, this is not about documentation. It's about transformation. And for transformation, you don't want to do research on, you want to do research with, and you want to learn from. Okay? So it makes that kind of distinction at the end, and I think a lot of what I'm talking about here resonates with that as well. So I think it's a different model, and in a way you're absolutely right. I'm getting in the seat. Okay? I'm a professor of applied psychology in Cork. I doubt I'd get a job in most psychology departments now. Okay? Because I'm so far over towards anthropology at this stage, I can't escape. Right? Yeah. And I wanted to try and answer that by saying something about board games. By saying something about board games, but I can't think of it. Wow, that's powerful.
John, thank you so
Okay,
much for
okay.
this.
Thank you.
And I will be around. I'm sorry I took up so much time talking. If anybody wants to follow up any of them, please, I'll be around tomorrow morning. And yeah, thanks for that.
Gå till tekniken också.
Want to come back?
Du ska ordna kvar till tekniken. Ja, gör det. Gör det. Ja, ta den. Ja, absolut.
Thank you. Sorry for the mix-up. Let's see. Sorry for the break. I had 100% and then I had 0% computer power. So sorry. I hope you could see most of it. I tried to check a lot. Yay! Thank you for joining.
Cheers.